Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's conversation about Germany's evolving policy toward China. We're joined today by 2021 ACG DZ Bank Fellow, Dr. Lily McElwee. She is currently a fellow at the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in Washington, D.C. And she recently published a paper on the topic we'll be discussing today. Lily, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve, for having me. Glad to be here.
So in your article titled The Rise and Demise of the EU-China Investment Agreement, Takeaways for the Future of German Debate on China, you highlight how Berlin's position on China is evolving. And I'll make sure to post a link to that paper in the chat for anybody who's interested. But before we dive in, can you sort of remind us what the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, or CAI, is and how it was negotiated? Because it was pretty complicated over many years. And so I think that's just a good sort of jumping off point for us for today's conversation.
Sure, absolutely. So the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, I'll just call it CAI here, as we go along in the conversation, would have replaced the bilateral investment agreements that 25 European states have with China. And just to take a step back and look at the motivations of Europe in negotiating this agreement, the decision to negotiate the agreement was made at the EU-China summit back in 2012. And at that time, European leaders found that investment levels in China were unacceptably low for what could be expected from two major economic blocs, the US and China, the EU and China. And that was because there were explicit and implicit restrictions on foreign investment access and operations in China. So a motivation of EU policymakers was to essentially remove those restrictions. And China had an interest in negotiating this agreement because this was back in 2012. And over the time period of negotiations, which went until 2020, China was becoming more of a capital exporter in the sense of showing growing interest in investing abroad, particularly in pursuit of strategic technology, strategic assets that were found in advanced economies in Europe, the United States, and Asia. So Chinese investment in Europe was growing, and China wanted to essentially ensure that some of the restrictions that were beginning to be discussed about Chinese investment in Europe, that China would still have access there. So those were the incentives of both sides. Mm-hmm. And the negotiations, I'll get into the negotiations in a second, but maybe it would help if I just discuss what was briefly in the agreement to give our listeners
that would help, yeah.
Yeah. So there were several main pillars of the agreement. It definitely covered market access. That was a major part of it. And market access in both manufacturing and services sectors. But China essentially, and I'll focus on China's promises to the EU because that's what we're discussing today, essentially followed a positive list approach, which is delineating the sectors that were open to European investment in China. And this list, by and large, simply codified openings that were happening already. Mm-hmm. It was seen as beneficial because it was putting those into treaty form, but there weren't major new openings to speak of, with a few exceptions. One exception, for example, was in cloud services. There was an investment ban on foreign investment in that area, and European firms were allowed to invest up to 50% in joint ventures in China. So that was seen as a win. There were wins like that, but overall codifying existing openings. There was also a level playing field section, which was actually seen as the best section for by German business, by European business, because it dealt with these large structural issues in market access in the Chinese economy that they've been dealing with for a very long time, like forced technology transfer, forced joint ventures. regulating the behavior of the transparency of subsidies, for example. These were big issues that were seen as wins, definitely, although there were some reservations about, given China's track record in following through on some of its promises in the past, WTO promises, for example, whether these would actually pan out. But on paper, they looked good. Then the third section I want to mention, because it proved very controversial, both in Germany and elsewhere, was a segment on sustainable development. So this dealt with environmental, labor concerns, corporate social responsibility. The labor concerns proved the most concerning, but essentially China promised to make continued and sustained efforts to ratify International Labor Organization conventions on forced labor. We can get back to that in the conversation, but that's what they agreed to. And then two final provisions that I wanted to mention were, there were some restrictions on foreign law firms in China, which proved controversial, as well as a restriction, essentially no new restrictions on NGOs in China, but confirming in treaty form that restrictions on foreign NGOs in China would persist. So that's kind of an overview of some of the big concessions from China that were discussed in the ensuing debate in Europe and Berlin after the political agreement of the CAI.
So Lily, I mean, if I heard you right, this sort of was sparked as far back as 2012, right? So almost a decade ago.
Right.
And if I remember correctly, the negotiating started, not right away, but I think in 2014. And so over the course of about 7 years and 35 meetings, one came up with the CAI.
Right.
And then the question came of sort of how to go about ratifying it and pushing it through. So it was a pretty drawn out process to begin with.
Yeah.
And it was, really sort of pushed through at the end of 2020, after the Europeans knew that Joe Biden had won the election and would be taking office. And at the end of Angela Merkel's sort of term as Germany's presidency of the EU, that she played a bit of a role in pushing through the agreement. Why was there this sudden push at that time to just get it done?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, you're definitely right. It was very slow moving and a very stop and start process throughout the 7 years of negotiation. And I'll just point out that the Council of the European Union gave the European Commission mandate to negotiate this agreement in 2013. And in that document, they say it should take no more than 2.5 years.
Wow. Okay.
And it took 7. So this was a drawn out process, and it moved very quickly at the end. In 2019, the EU and Chinese negotiators agreed that they'd have it done by December 2020. But I note that even by the end of as we were nearing the end of 2020, few expected it to actually happen, because there were a few holdouts, and one of them was the labor forced labor convention part that I mentioned earlier. But Merkel did push it through at the end, and it's a little bit of a mystery to a lot of people why that happened. I have several guesses. I think this is not the main reason, but I think one contributing factor was just a sense of wanting a strong track record for Germany's presidency, EU presidency, maybe some good old German efficiency, and just getting it done after what was a very drawn out process. But I think beyond that, I think taking a step back, Merkel was looking at a time period where she'd been dealing with an administration in the United States that had shown very little interest in transatlantic cooperation and the transatlantic relationship. And I know that there were personal frictions with Trump. And so I think she was trying to position Europe not equidistant from the US and China, but in a position where it was going to make its own agreements with China separate from the United States, especially since the United States Phase 1 agreement with China had just come about. So the US had just had its own deal with China, and I think she probably felt that that this was long overdue as a business agreement, but also that the timing wasn't actually too bad because Europe was making its own agreement to match the United States's.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. And so, just going back in time, and we'll come back to sort of some of the pivots in Germany, because that's really what we want to focus most of our time on today. But I think it's really interesting after this long drawn out sort of lead up with fits and starts. The Kai was basically signed off on, pushed through at the end of 2020. And then all of a sudden in May of 2021, the European Parliament voted to suspend ratification. And that sort of sends a little bit of a highlight note on what you were talking about, that there was some concern from some people as to whether this would even happen or not, that there were some somewhat controversial provisions in the agreement. But what contributed to the European Parliament's decision to suspend ratification, and why was this agreement sort of so short-lived, if you will?
Yeah, so the main reason, the most immediate reason that this agreement was suspended was a series of tit for tat sanctions between Europe and China at that time. In March, I think it was March 22nd, the EU issued some very minor sanctions, very targeted sanctions on several officials involved in the crackdown in Xinjiang, the internment practices in Xinjiang. And the same day, Beijing issued sanctions, now famous sanctions, on 10 individuals, 4 entities in Europe. And these were very prominent entities. Merix was sanctioned, Reinhard Bütikofer was sanctioned. These definitely drew public attention toward the issue and issue among the European Parliament because parliamentarians were targeted. So that was the most immediate reason. In May 2021, the European Parliament voted to freeze ratification. It's still frozen. But I think, as you hinted, the broader geopolitical environment had certainly changed between when the sanctions were, well, actually when the deal was put forth and back in 2012 when it started. Mm-hmm. Several things were different. And I'll go into those in just a second, but I thought I'd mention that on a broader EU level, there were some states that weren't happy with this agreement. Belgium and Netherlands thought the human rights concerns piece weren't addressed well. Poland was skeptical because of the timing with a Biden administration coming in. But I think it's interesting that the Kai was really introduced at this nexus, right? So the Trump administration, which had pursued a more unilateral approach, was being replaced by an incoming Biden administration, which was explicitly talking about coordinating with European and Asian allies on China, and dropping hints that it really would like the EU maybe not to press forward with this agreement so that we could take a step back and do something like this together. But importantly, and I think this was the key driver of European parliamentarian sentiment on China around the time, was that over the past few years, before 2020, China's foreign policy and domestic policy had really changed in a meaningful way. In terms of, the crackdown in Xinjiang, this has been going on for a long time, but it was increasingly coming to light. The crackdown in Hong Kong was a galvanizing force, which we can discuss later, but I think it really woke a lot of people up to the fact that this vibrant democratic island the situation could change so fast, and it showed China's authoritarian hand. But also more close to home, I think the wolf warrior diplomats were out on Twitter, and COVID had really ravaged Europe over the past year in 2020. And rather than provide a lot of assistance, China had essentially sought to benefit both diplomatically and economically from that. It parroted disinformation, about COVID's origins. It highlighted these tragedies that were happening in Europe as a sign that the West was in decay. It was selling PPE at cost not at cost, at a profit to Europe. And I think that there was a sense that this really clarified to a lot of people in Europe, and I think also in Berlin, that this part of the three parts approach to China of systemic rivalry, economic competition, and partnership. This is a systemic rivalry. We have fundamental differences on fundamental issues, and this is an embodiment of that. So I think that the timing was not conducive to an agreement. The immediate problem was the sanctions, but I think the broader environment was also problematic.
So it sounds like there were sort of a number of different factors that really contributed to this, almost, it's hard to say sudden spike, because it seems as if among some decision makers there were concerns all along, but there really, things really kind of came to a head in the spring of 2021 in Europe, both at the EU level, but then also at various nation states. And it seems like there were a number of factors that contributed to this sort of renewed mistrust of China. And I was actually wondering sort of how much of that had to do with COVID and concerns about the origin of the virus, but then also seeing how China was, as you say, selling PPE at a profit and taking advantage of the situation. Mm-hmm. But also recognition that by that point, sort of by the end of 2020, we had seen a great sort of deal of disruption with supply chains. Questions around reliability of economic partners were being asked. And so there were a lot of different factors that contributed. I mean, so I guess one sort of question about that is you cited a number of things. Do you think that there was one factor in particular that was really catalytic, or do you think it was just this perfect storm combination of a variety of disparate factors that really put the European leaders sort of on pause and created caution?
I think at the European level, I think all played a role. I think some more than others. For example, if China hadn't been doing any of the other things and was doing wolf warrior diplomacy, I don't think that would have had the same impact. Mm-hmm. I think it was, so I think that was maybe just an add-on. I think the COVID situation was really eye-opening. And I'd recommend everyone look at Andrew Small's book from the German Marshall Fund on this, because he really delves into how Europe was affected by China's behavior in the COVID pandemic. And it opened my eyes to that. Every country was struggling with how to react to that. But I think that there was a sense that China was seeking to benefit by drawing attention to the slow reactions, the mismanagement, at a time of very little information for European leaders and US leaders about how to deal with this. I think that was pivotal, but I also would say that began in 2020, but before then there were some serious issues that were coming to light. And I think particularly in Germany, the Hong Kong crackdown was pivotal, mm-hmm. in my view, because I think on two levels. One, it was shocking in its own right, and saddening to many, and I think showed that China was willing to do things that would risk international backlash, and still proceed with them anyway. Mm-hmm. So it showed the hand of a more confident China and a more assertive China, and I think that was worrisome in its own right. But I think beyond that, Merkel's reaction to that incident was muted. And what that did was that muted reaction from Germany was seen as unacceptable to many parliamentarians, policymakers in other parties, and had, I think, a galvanizing role in terms of showing a lot of folks that Germany's approach might be a little bit outdated, and a little bit not keeping up with the realities of a changing China.
So I'd like to definitely drill down on sort of the debate in Germany in just a minute. But before we do that, we have a couple of viewer questions that I'd like to fold in because they're a little bit more broad. And one of our viewers is curious whether China's Belt and Road Initiative had any impact or effect on the KAI or vice versa.
Or vice versa. Okay. I think so. I think it had an indirect impact on the KAI. I think it was part and parcel of a more visibly assertive, internationally prominent China. And the Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013. China was pledging a lot of money to invest in countries along the Belt and Road, many in the global South, and many important, not necessarily economically, but in global governance institutions, in voting behavior in these major institutions like the UN. So it was clearly an influence building operation, and I think that was, as I say, part of a broader package of Chinese policies that moved European policymakers into a new way of viewing China, also US policymakers. So that's how I'd say I'd say it was an indirect effect. I don't think it affected necessarily the negotiations or the substance of the KAI too much.
So so thank you for that. Another viewer question, and this is something that you had touched on a little bit earlier, sort of what was going on bilaterally between the US and China as the KAI was being negotiated between the EU and China. One of our viewers is curious what role the bilateral US-China phase one negotiations were having, and whether that sort of, to what degree that caused the EU to press forward and move forward with their negotiations as well.
I think it definitely played a role. I think it showed that, in two ways. One, the U.S. was acting unilaterally, and that although many in Europe are transatlanticists, there was a sense that if the U.S. is acting unilaterally, then that gives us the freedom to act unilaterally as well. And there wasn't any prospect of that changing back then. It changed with the Biden administration coming in. But given that there was a prospect that this is the way the US is going to operate, I think it created a mindset, okay, well, maybe we need to operate in this way. But also the US was getting some concessions like that, the cloud services, that ban being lifted. That happened in the phase one agreement too. So there were these concessions that the United States was getting in a sense that, okay, well, maybe we can actually get some concessions for European businesses too, to match those concessions that the Americans are getting.
So one of our viewers here in New York is sort of curious to hear your sense as we fast forward to today. And she wonders whether you could help us by evaluating recent rhetoric from China in which Beijing claims that it is actively courting foreign investment. And the viewer goes on to write, European chambers of commerce point out that all the headwinds for European companies investing in China, including China favoring its own industries and geopolitical tensions, right? So there's a lot going on there. But do you expect any consequential positive overtures from Europe to Europe from President Xi in his third term? Or do you think that we are sort of pursuing a path of strategic recoupling between China and Europe?
I think that That's a complicated question because I think it's a very good question and there's so many different angles to it. I think on the one hand, in my view, China finds Europe very important right now as a geopolitical player. It sees tensions with the United States rising. It sees the United States implementing technology controls, export controls, outbound investment screening, to what it sees as constrain China's economic and technological development. And indeed, they are intended to slow China's economic and technological development, but it doesn't see this pattern stopping as relations with the US deteriorate. And what it sees an opportunity to do is to essentially ensure that the US is not able to multilateralize those as much as possible, as much as it would like. And so I think it wants to keep Europe in play. So I think that China has a strategic interest in offering Europe at least tactical concessions to slow the shift of debate in European capitals. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That said, sorry, to get to the second part, I think that it is promising for Europe that there are overtures for further foreign investment, I think the general direction in China is toward a situation where the environment becomes even more difficult for foreign firms. And that's just because of China's domestic priorities. It sees the international environment as getting less secure for China. And as a result, it's pursuing what can be called securitization of the economy. Mm-hmm. Further party control, further crackdowns on media freedoms, further restrictions, not only on domestic, but also foreign firms. So I think the general trend, although the rhetoric may say otherwise, is toward a situation where there are more restrictions rather than less. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So let's hone in on Germany and on the debate in Germany, because your piece sort of says that the CHI can really sort of shine a spotlight and provide some insights on some of the changing perceptions of China in Germany, and help sort of unpack how the debate about bilateral and EU-Chinese relations have evolved since then. But I think it's really interesting to think about the Merkel government sort of really playing a key role in pushing through the CHI toward the end of 2020. And then, of course, 2021 being a very important election year where it was clear that Angela Merkel was not going to run again. And it was, not clear what the new government was going to look like. And so you had, different parties coming out and taking somewhat different positions. I mean, foreign policy did not play a huge role in that election campaign by any stretch of the imagination. But I think it's fair to say that the conservative Christian Democrats and even the Social Democrats were a little bit more muted in their position on China, vis-a-vis particularly the Greens. Annalena Baerbock was taking an incredibly hawkish, hardline view on China, on Russia, but also the Free Democrats during the 2021 election campaign. And of course, that's the year where there was this back and forth over the CHI, certainly in the early months of the year. What's sort of your assessment of what the policy perspective on China was from the various political parties in Germany in 2021? And then we can talk a little bit about how that's evolved, over the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the CHI in a way provides a really good window on this, because essentially it was introduced around the same time that transatlantic relations were changing, China was changing, debate in Europe was changing. And essentially what it would have done is to deepen economic ties with China, right? Mm-hmm. So it offers a good gauge of how different parties felt about that. And I think what we saw is, first off, in the federal election campaign, certain parties were discussing China a lot more than others. And I think that's just indicative of stance. SPD and CDU didn't mention China as much, for example, in their manifestos as the Greens and the FDP did. So there was certainly a more of a willingness to speak out about issues related to China among the Greens and the FDP. And beyond that, I think the balance of where parties were standing on that three-part approach to China, systemic rivalry, economic competition, and partnership, were changing at that time. And I think this is a little bit tough because I think even since 2021, we've seen some evolutions in that, which we can discuss. But I'll just start with the 2021 part. At that time, the Greens and the FDP were clearly more of a unified view that systemic rivalry couldn't be separated from economic partnership and competition, but rather part and parcel of it. And I think the CAI shows us that very well. So the Greens and the FDP were essentially opposed to the CAI being ratified as it was. And the chief reason was that they didn't feel like China's commitments to curtail forced labor practices went far enough. Mm-hmm. So that's an example of parties saying, we can't pursue this economic engagement because this value issue is not part of it, is not sufficient. Mm-hmm. So there was a sense that we can't pursue economic engagement independently of pursuit of promotion of our values. We have to do both at the same time, or one as a condition of the other. And the reason I say it's different from now is because the other two parties, SPT and CDU, although certain lawmakers definitely felt that way, the party views were not the same. Mm-hmm. So the CDU explicitly said, the parliamentary group leader explicitly said it would be naive to expect the investment agreement to bring about system change in China. And that's obviously a broader statement, but I think it goes to show the contrast between the two viewpoints at that stage, where, the view was essentially our economic partnership is important. We're going to do that. We're going to talk about these other issues, maybe quietly, but we're not going to make one a condition of the other. So I think that was a little bit of, that gives you a taste for where the different parties were on China at the time. And then, we can talk about how they've changed, because they have changed a little bit.
Well, I mean, there's been really kind of an incredible evolution, I think. And so if we do kind of fast forward to today, it's important to think about the role that the pandemic has played in sort of changing or shaping the position of Berlin when it comes to China, but of course the war in Ukraine. And as many of our viewers know, I've often asked the question of our speakers of how Germany might be drawing lessons from the evolution of its Russlandpolitik, or its Russia policy, when it comes to its China policy, whether Germany is learning any lessons when it comes to this dependence and dependency. And that's certainly something that's in the spotlight more so today. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how over the course of 2022 and into this year, you have seen the positions sort of evolve a little bit in Berlin.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that the Ukraine war has been a wake-up call in so many ways. For Germany, it's clearly been a wake-up call that economic interdependence has to be related to security concerns, creates security vulnerabilities, rather than separate from them. So in a way, I think the Ukraine war really helped drive home this view that we have to look at economic relations with other states in a broader framework. And that economic interdependence can create vulnerabilities as well as benefits. And I think since then we've seen, we've seen Annalena Baerbock come to office as the foreign minister and be very out front about China, and as well as Russia, of course, in her own way, and actually publicly call out Chancellor Scholz in several ways. For example, she vocally opposed the Costco deal. Mm-hmm. She said, it's all right that you're going to Beijing, but we expect you to adhere to our coalition agreement. And this was these were very public positions that she took to make sure that Germany as a whole moves in the direction that she would like. And I applaud her for being so out front and vocal about those issues. I think I would say that what has clearly happened, I would not say that anyone holds a Merkelian approach toward China anymore. I think that those days are over. The question is how far we'll see the change ensue. So I think that there's no one who thinks that we can just have our economic relationship with China and not think about any other aspects. I think every party, for example, thinks that it's necessary to reduce strategic dependence on China. That is something that even as he went to Beijing, Chancellor Scholz wrote an op-ed ahead of time saying, I think that we need to reduce risky dependencies and improve our economic resilience. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing some of that play out in the China strategy, which we can talk about, but I think that the baseline has changed. I think that there are a few parties and few lawmakers who would adopt a fully business first approach toward China. I think the question is to what degree economic ties can be separated from some of the other aspects of our relationship of Germany's relationship with China.
So that's maybe a perfect segue. I mean, I think all of us know that Berlin is working on a national security strategy, and obviously China plays a role in that national security strategy. But there's also a separate China strategy that's being worked on, a copy of which was leaked a few weeks ago, and so I know that they're still working on that. But what do you think we can expect from the Traffic Light Coalition's forthcoming China policy? I mean, what are you expecting to see there that might be interesting or surprising?
Mm-hmm. So I think based on the draft, it will include efforts to invest in Germany, so improve Germany's technological competitiveness. It will include efforts to combat climate change, which is another German priority. But importantly, it will also include efforts to reduce strategic dependencies on China. I think we're guaranteed to see those types of efforts in the agreement. And then the question is how to operationalize those. And so one source of disagreement that I see, for example, between Chancellor Scholz and the Greens and FDP-controlled ministries is, although that there is this agreement that risky dependencies need to be reduced, there's a question of what risky means. What does strategic mean? So, we saw Chancellor Scholz approve the Costco deal over the objections of ministers, not only from the Greens and the FDP, but also from his own party. Mm-hmm. And that, to many lawmakers, was confusing because it was to them very clearly critical infrastructure. So there's a question of, okay, well, if that wasn't seen as risky strategic dependency, then where is the line? And I think that how to operationalize that is probably a point of contention, especially since the business community probably has an interest in making that a smaller yard with a higher fence than a larger yard. And then
let me maybe push you on that just a little bit, right? So that's obviously sort of a point of contention within the government. But then let's also think about the main opposition party, the Christian Democrats, right? You had already said that there's a shift away from sort of the Merkel-esque view of China, and that there's some sobering thinking going on within the CDU and CSU as far as China is concerned. But the Christian Democrats are often touted as sort of the party that's close to business. I mean, the Free Democrats are as well. But do you see sort of points of contention, not just within the government, but also between the government and the opposition?
To me, the SPD is the odd one out at this point. I think actually based on the CDU CSU position paper on China that just came out, there's actually quite a surprising degree of alignment between their view now on paper and the view that the Greens and the FDP hold, which is essentially that the Wandel-durch-Handel approach is not working, has not worked for a long time, and we need to retire it. And Zeitenwende should not only apply to Russia, but also China.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that is something that Scholz doesn't necessarily feel like. So I think that we saw in that position paper, for example, annual checks of dependency were suggested. The idea of a business first paradigm was explicitly rejected. This is a definitely sort of a 180 turn from the Merkel days. And I'd also note that Friedrich Merz was against the Costco deal, came out against Scholz's trip to China. All of these positions are aligning much more with the Greens and the FDP than with Scholz and the Chancellery.
Mm-hmm. So this is really kind of a marked change to the debate within Germany as far as China is concerned. What other sort of threads are worth picking out or topics are worth picking up on as you look at what's going on in Germany? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the political side of things, but we've also talked a little bit about the economic side of things and the business side of things, but not quite as much.
The economic side of things is really interesting. And my eyes were opened a little bit when I was doing this research, because I was talking with members of German industry and some of the major German business organizations. And, I think that there's no doubt that geopolitical developments have shaped the outlook for German business in China, just the way that they've shaped the environment for American businesses, Canadian businesses, Japanese businesses in China. All of these global businesses in China, because of China shifting international behavior, shifting relations with the US, shifting relations with the West. So I think that there is an overarching sense of geopolitical risk in approaching China right now. But I was interested to hear some businesses say that they weren't actually that disappointed when the Kai was frozen, because they were planning to continue to invest in China anyway. That they didn't need this deal to do it. They would have liked it, but first off, it wasn't a ton of new market openings, as I said before. And secondly, they didn't need it to continue doing what they were doing. And I think that there's a sense that despite slowing growth in China, despite US-China, EU-China tensions, despite changes in Chinese regulations that make it more difficult to invest, despite all of these factors, there is growth to be had in China for many businesses. Whether that's multinationals or financial firms investing in China, there's still growth to be had because of the size of the market. Mm-hmm. And the geopolitical risk at this point is there, but it's diffuse. It's not a concrete risk. Few businesses, for example, think that Xi Jinping will invade Taiwan tomorrow. It may be something on their radar. They may be scenario planning, especially the big ones. But because that geopolitical risk is diffuse and there's growth to be had and profits to be made, I think there's continued interest in investing in China for major manufacturing firms in Germany and their key suppliers. So I think that because of that, there will continue to be a pro-engagement voice in the debate in China. And I think, we've seen in the BDI's paper as of 2019, which was very forward-leaning, that's not going to come at the expense of, encouraging Germany to protect its interests and its values. But it is going to mean that there is a tug of war, a push and pull between the business community and efforts to go too far in the other direction of values over economic interests.
So particularly since you just mentioned Taiwan, there are a couple questions related to Taiwan that have come in from some of our viewers. One of them is interested in knowing to what degree German, but also other European companies are thinking about what their response might be or what their strategy might be if China does blockade and then invade Taiwan. Is that something that they're thinking about seriously?
Yes. I think every business that has a lot of investments in China is thinking very seriously about this, whether that's European business or American business, any of those major global businesses, foreign businesses in China are thinking seriously about this because it's so in the news, because it is clearly a huge point of contention in the US-China relationship, which is becoming more contentious in general. I think every business is scenario planning to the extent that they have the resources to do so. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that there is a wide range of scenarios that businesses are playing with. I mean, there's a full-scale kinetic invasion of China, and then there's everything before that. Already there's disinformation campaigns in Taiwan. There's attempted electoral interference. But we could have a scenario where, just as an example, like Taiwanese and Chinese fighter jets collide accidentally, and then what happens? How does it escalate or de-escalate from there? These are sanctions imposed at some stage in the process. These are situations that, if you have a lot of money in China, you absolutely have to be thinking about right now. Mm-hmm. So I think that they are. My sense is that there is still continued interest, and that it will very much depend on what happens. So what scenario we're dealing with in that range of scenarios in terms of how businesses respond. Mm-hmm.
So related to Taiwan and related to what you were just saying, another viewer has a slightly different question, which is, do you think that Germany will help the United States defend Taiwan against interference from China?
Well, I think that the United States is supposed to have a position of strategic ambiguity, so not a security guarantee for Taiwan. Or not, not encourage Taiwan to declare independence. I would assume if we get to a situation where the United States is involved in a cross-strait conflict, that Germany would, at that point already, have potentially aided the United States in prior steps, such as sanctions, I would assume. I know that's, it's not a guarantee. The decision was made quite quickly when Putin invaded Ukraine, mm-hmm. To have this unified Western sanctions approach, but it wasn't guaranteed. It was negotiated on the spot. So my expectation is yes, but I'm not certain about that.
So backing up, just a little bit, and looking more closely at the relationship between China and Russia, Xi just visited Moscow, and I know that that's something that you've been following pretty closely as well. But what's your take on how the Europeans are watching that relationship between Xi and Putin, but also just more broadly between Beijing and Moscow, between China and Russia?
So Europe has clearly not been that pleased with China's behavior in this conflict so far. Over the past year, China has suffered serious reputational damage in Brussels, in European capitals, because it's provided economic and diplomatic support for Russia, if not material support for its war effort. I think the meeting in Moscow was interesting because, on the one hand, just the fact that President Xi chose Russia as his first state visit after his re-election as president is a symbolic gesture that the China-Russia partnership is strong. Although they're no longer using the language of no limits, mm-hmm. It is a solid partnership with a country that has damaged European interests, Europe and Europe overall, by invading the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. So I think that there's in general concern. However, the meeting was interesting to me because of the reactions in Europe afterwards. In Brussels, in a lot of European capitals, we had leaders saying, given this partnership, we have to work really hard to make sure that China doesn't fall more into the Russian camp, and go over the edge and provide lethal aid and arms to China, to Russia's war effort. So I think that in a way, it created a little bit of diplomatic space for Xi Jinping, especially as he's about to greet a lot of European leaders in Beijing, to open up conversations about engagement with China, as a bid to make sure that partnership doesn't grow stronger with Putin.
Mm-hmm. So related to that, one of our viewers just submitted a question saying, you mentioned geopolitical risk being viewed by business as somewhat subdued. How are businesses viewing the risk of major sanctions toward China if China delivers lethal weapons to help support Russia's efforts in Ukraine?
My sense is they're viewing them seriously. Especially European businesses, because this is it's a war on the European continent. There is, obviously it's a sort of a moral connection as well as an economic one. So I think that, if sanctions are, I don't know that, I think that they're viewing China's potential provision of weapons to Russia very seriously, as something that would create a situation where they'd have some very difficult interests to reconcile.
So you're obviously based in Washington right now, but you have your finger on the pulse of what's going on in Europe and particularly in Germany. One of our viewers from Germany is curious whether you see sort of a unified or uniform position on China in Washington. He actually said, do you see groupthink on China in DC? You've kind of parsed for us the different viewpoints in Berlin, but do you see different viewpoints in Washington, or is there greater alignment?
I think there's greater alignment with the baseline assumptions. So I think that first off, just historically, U.S. debate on China moved sooner than European debate on China did. It was back in 2016, 2017 that departments of the Obama administration were starting to rethink the assumption that economic interdependence with China was a good thing, and that it would lead to economic if not political liberalization. So that obviously began to operationalize in the Trump administration, and then Congress was long skeptical of China. But also had maybe a broader systematic change in views about what China's rise would mean for the United States, based, I would say, on China's behavior over that time period. So I think that already we have much more history in terms of systematic, widespread skepticism of China in the United States than is the case in Europe, where debate shifted a little bit later. Now, I think that there are certainly there are debates at the margin. I would say there are debates on, if we are to go about export controls, for example, how what technologies we should be controlling. There are sort of marginal debates on those issues. And then I think there are also debates on, and I think this actually goes to the question of small yard, high fence. So, when we look at our economic relationship with China, how much of it should be sensitive and how much should not? For example, there are lawmakers now who are saying we need to look at restricting Chinese investments in U.S. farmland. We need to look at Chinese investments in land overall. And probably a better approach is to look at which types of land investments are national security sensitive or not. And there are certainly some who say land investments should not be our focus. Our focus should be on transfer of technologies that are dual use to China. So I think that there are these, it's a question of how wide our focus should be and how we should implement policies. But I think there's general agreement that the types of actions that the Biden administration has taken are generally the direction we should be going.
Mm-hmm. So maybe the final question is the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, was recently in Washington, D.C., and obviously the war in Ukraine was, top of the agenda in her conversations with President Biden. But not far behind that was undoubtedly China. And so I guess one question is, what's kind of your readout on the USEU position on China? And as a corollary to that, do you think that we'll see greater transatlantic unity vis-a-vis China?
So I think undoubtedly the EU and US are closer on China than they ever have been, perhaps, at least in the past 5 years. I think it's a function of where the US is, but also a function of how far Europe has moved on this issue. That said, I think that there isn't complete alignment. And I think that to some degree is a factor of disagreement in both capitals about how far we should go on China. But especially in the European Union, with all of its component member states who feel differently about their relationship with China, it becomes hard to have to give a sense of a unified view. I like to look at it as a sort of Venn diagram, in a sense of, there are some states that think that we need all three of these parts of our relationship and we should emphasize systemic rivalry a lot, maybe as a condition of the others. But then there are these states which have very different economic relationships with China and very different, I wouldn't say values, but senses of how much we should emphasize values. So I think that there's still a way to go for complete alignment. And I would also say that there are risks. So the final thing I'll say is that the United States has what Secretary of State Blinken has called an invest, align, compete approach to China. Invest at home, align with allies, and compete in terms of, technology controls and all of that. And I think the question is whether it can do all three parts at once, and to the extent to which the alignment part can still happen when the United States is doing things like investing at home with the, Inflation Reduction Act, which obviously created immense frictions with Europe, which saw it as protectionist. And then, these unilateral actions like export controls, outbound investment that Europe has to sort of catch up on, in a sense. So I think that can be done. I think it just has to be done right, in consultation with Europe, hearing concerns from Europe in advance to make sure that these are joint efforts.
Thank you. I have one final question for you, Lily. As you know, here in the United States, there have been growing calls to ban TikTok, or at least to pass bipartisan legislation to give the Biden administration legal authority to seek a ban. And one of our viewers is curious whether you have any opinion on this potential TikTok ban and what the position of the government should be.
I don't use TikTok. I think that there are risks from TikTok that go beyond its Chinese ownership, but that's another question. My sense is that it is, it's the direction that we're going to be moving in terms of looking at our technology relationship with China in a security framework. And I think that we're there, and I don't think that'll change.
I mean, I think in that sense, in terms of security and technology in the same sentence with China, then also, of course, raises the question around Huawei and ZTE in Germany, and sort of there's kind of it's a very different debate, but in some levels a similar debate brewing in Germany right now about removing some of the Huawei components from Deutsche Telekom, Telefonica, Vodafone infrastructures, and how costly that might be. So, I mean, I think you're right. Looking ahead, there will definitely be sort of debates in both countries, on both sides of the Atlantic, related to technology and security when it comes to China, and big concerns there. But that might also be an opportunity for greater collaboration between the US and Europe as well.
Absolutely. I certainly hope for that. I think that there definitely is scope. It just has to be done the right way within the right frameworks. And I certainly think that more venues for dialogue are good.
Well, Lily, thank you for engaging in dialogue with us today. This has been a fantastic conversation. The last hour has passed incredibly quickly. But I just want to thank you for your incredible insights and for sharing your thoughts with us. And I hope that we stay in touch and have another opportunity to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Steve. So do I. And I really appreciate the opportunity to do this research. And I hope I can carry it forward, because this is an area that is changing rapidly. So there'll be developments to follow.
Excellent. Well, take care and have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.